Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Theo. I'm a bookseller here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's conversation between Kim Fu and Danya Kukafka, who are with us to launch both of their new books, Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century and Notes on an Execution. We are broadcasting tonight's event from our store at Ravenna in front of a small group of friends and guests. We are proud to host a number of exciting virtual and in-person events this season, which you can find on our website. Tomorrow night at 7 p.m., we're excited to welcome David Guterson to the main stage at Third Place Books in Lake Forest Park. And on the morning of February 19th, we're co-hosting a special virtual appearance from Nobel Prize-winning author Olga Tokarczuk in conversation with her translator Croft and Rabi Alameddin. And we have so much more planned as well. Again, you can find our full events calendar and sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com. For those of you watching at home, the chat window on the side of your screen is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. If we experience any technical difficulties tonight, we have a dedicated crew running our live stream equipment, and we will do our best to get things running again as soon as possible. Thank you. And if you miss any part of tonight's event, not to worry. This recording will be available on YouTube soon after we wrap up. Tonight we'll be taking questions from both our virtual audience and our in-person audience. So if you have any questions for our authors this evening, submit them to the chat and we will sort those questions out and pass them along to our authors during the last 20 minutes of today's event. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Kim Fu is an author of fiction and poetry from Vancouver, British Columbia, now based here in Seattle, Washington. Her first novel, For Today I Am a Boy, won the Edmund White Award for debut fiction, while her second, The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore, was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. And Danya Kukafka is the author of two novels, with her debut, Girl in Snow, receiving widespread acclaim and praise from the likes of Paula Hawkins and Britt Bennett. She grew up in Colorado before relocating to New York City and later Seattle. She has worked in nearly every facet of the publishing industry, including as an associate editor at Riverhead Books. And we're incredibly fortunate to celebrate not one, but two new works of fiction tonight. Kim Fu's Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, published this week by Tin House Books, is a collection of short stories by turns visceral, haunting, funny, and precise, blending elements of science fiction and horror in ever-surprising and thought-provoking combinations. In a review published today, NPR's book critic Gabino Iglesias concludes that the collection cements Fu as one of the most exciting short story writers in contemporary literature, and I agree. I had the pleasure of asking Kim some questions about the book for an upcoming issue of the Shelf Awareness newsletter, and I was just so impressed by the clarity and insight with which she spoke about her process and the inspiration behind these stories, and I'm excited for her to share the same with you all here tonight. Notes on an Execution is Danya Kukafka's second novel, published just last week by William Morrow. You may have seen it featured on the cover of this week's New York Times Book Review, where Katie Kitamura calls it beautifully drawn and dense with detail and specificity, and perhaps even more notably, Notes on an Execution is the current staff pick of our very own Kalani Kapahua, manager here at Ravenna Third Place Books. Kalani says the novel is a deeply humanistic character study of a serial killer and the people affected by his crimes, and a wonderfully profound and empathetic thriller. Danya has also been a good friend to Third Place Books for years and has even been spotted working on her writing right back in Cafe Arta, which makes us all the more happy that she has chosen to come here to share this novel with us. So please join me in welcoming Kim Fu and Danya Kukafka.
Okay, hi everybody. This is so exciting. Kim and I were just saying this is both of our only in-person hybrid in-person events. So it's particularly exciting to be here today.
Those intros are always so emotionally overwhelming, and then you have to come right up, and after someone said such incredibly nice things about you.
I know. I'm like, oh no, that is me. So Kim and I have a long, very fun history of our friendship and how we came to write these books, which we will tell you a little more about. And I have a lot of questions for you, and I know you have some questions for me.
I do, yes.
But I thought first we could read a little bit. So you go right ahead.
Sounds good. Danya also nicely warned me about these stools. So I'm going to be reading from one of the stories from the collection. In this fantasy, I am a princess on the morning of the revolution. Slightly dim-witted, bred and raised for acquiescence, contented and pampered like show cattle. I wake in my canopy-covered bed, and only one of my 3 maids is there, the other 2 having fled in the night, along with half the staff. Our servants will be seen as longtime collaborators, stooges, bootlickers, enemies of the people. Some stay because they believe it is the safest choice, some out of a Stockholm syndrome-like loyalty, some because they've never known anything else. She bathes me in the bathtub by the window. We are on one of the highest floors of the palace, facing the inner courtyard and the tittering dovecote, but we can still hear the rabble in the distance, the mob that has encroached upon the outer walls. As though it were any other morning, she massages lavender oil into my scalp, milky almond oil into my ephemerally pale skin, my unused muscles supple as raw veal, my brow uncannily blank and expressionless. Not beautiful, per se, more like a woman-sized baby, marvelously preserved. No one has ever asked me to think or make a decision. We hear a high-pitched shriek echo from somewhere else in the palace, the din from outside developing the regular, drum-like rhythm of chanting and marching, the distinctive tinkling crash of windows being broken. After she ties me into my underlayers and gown, I wouldn't know how to get them on and off if I had to, the maid curtsies and hurries out. I float daintily, regally, through the hall connecting my bedchamber and my private sitting room. One of the paintings is askew, another missing, tucked under the arm of an absconding servant, leaving behind a square patch of brighter wallpaper. In my sitting room, my breakfast has been laid out as usual. Exotic fruits, vibrantly colored as jewels, so ripe the flesh is nearly bursting through the skin, or candied, macerated, glazed to a mirror shine. Thumb-sized pastries, sugar whirls drawn with a pin. Drinking chocolate, porridge with sweet cream, pickled vegetables, blue speckled boiled eggs, smoked fish and meat with mustard, nearly enough food for the starving rabble outside, from which I will, as every morning, idly pick a few bites and leave the rest to spoil. I sit in a large, overstuffed armchair facing the door. I arrange my skirts, spread them neatly over the edges of the chair, my slippered feet sinking into the sumptuous carpet. Hanging tapestries warm the walls, celestial scenes that will be treasured in museums for centuries to come. I am aware that I am about to die. I have been kept almost entirely away from pain and violence, from complex sensation, from ordinary people who I now imagine will tear me apart like dogs. I feel the relief of a debtor releasing coins from his fist, a weight lifted, no longer beholden. Just imagine it. No longer feeling guilty for everything you have and don't deserve. For an unjust world bent in your favor, paying the piper at last. Wasn't it worth it, after all? My head on a pike for this sweet, short, pleasure-drenched life.
It's beautiful. I'm also going to read a little bit from the second chapter of my novel. All you need to know is that this is from the perspective of my serial killer's mother. Her name is Lavender, and the year is 1973. If there was a before, it began with Lavender. She was 17 years old. She knew what it meant to bring life into the world, the gravity. She knew that love could swaddle you tight and also bruise. But until the time came, Lavender did not understand what it meant to walk away from a thing she'd grown from her own insides. Tell me a story, Lavender gasped between contractions. She was splayed out in the barn on a blanket propped against a stack of hay. Johnny crouched over her with a lantern, his breath curling white in the frigid late winter air. "The baby," Lavender said. "Tell me about the baby." It was becoming increasingly clear that the baby might actually kill her. Every contraction proved how horribly unprepared they were. Despite all Johnny's bravado and the passages he quoted from the medical textbooks his grandfather had left, neither of them knew much about childbirth. The books hadn't mentioned this. The blood, apocalyptic. The pain, white-hot and sweat-soaked. "He'll grow up to be president," Johnny said. "He'll be a king." Lavender groaned. She could feel the baby's head tearing at her skin, a grapefruit half exited. "You don't know it's a boy," she panted. "Besides, there's no such thing as kings anymore." She pushed until the walls of the barn went crimson. Her body felt full of glass shards, a jagged inner twisting. When the next contraction came, Lavender sank into it, her throat breaking into a guttural scream. "He'll be good," Johnny said. "He'll be brave and smart and powerful. I can see his head, Lav. You have to keep pushing." Blackout. Her whole self converged into one shattering wound. The shriek came then, a mewling cry. Johnny was covered in gore, up to his elbows, and Lavender watched as he picked up the gardening shears he'd sterilized with alcohol, then used them to cut the umbilical cord. Seconds later, Lavender was holding it. Her child. Slick with afterbirth, foamy around the head, the baby was a tangle of furious limbs. In the lantern's glow, his eyes were nearly black. He did not look like a baby, Lavender thought. Little purple alien. Johnny slumped beside her in the hay, panting. "Look," he rasped. "Look at what we made, my girl." The feeling hit Lavender just in time. A love so consuming, it felt more like panic. The sensation was followed immediately by a nauseous tidal guilt, because Lavender knew, from the second she saw the baby, that she did not want this kind of love. It was too much, too hungry. But it had been growing inside her all these months, and now it had fingers, toes. It was gulping oxygen. Johnny wiped the baby down with a towel and positioned him firmly against Lavender's nipple. As she peered down at the scrunched and flaking bundle, Lavender was thankful for the dark of the barn, the sweaty damp of her face. Johnny hated when she cried. Lavender placed a palm on the ball of the baby's head, those initial traitorous thoughts already laced with regret. She drowned the feeling with assurances, murmured against the baby's slippery skin. "I will love you like the ocean loves the sand." They named the baby Ansel.
That scene is so harrowing.
A little
Like,
dark, I'm sorry.
all on its own, it's so harrowing. And then knowing what comes, like that you're like, this is my serial killer's mother, makes it all the more intense.
A little dark. Do you want to start by giving everyone just like your little spiel about the book? You know, you have the like, here's what my book is, and then we can just like do that first so people sort of know what we're here about.
Sure.
Yeah.
It is a short story collection of 12 stories that play with the fantastical and is a blend of genres. As was mentioned, it has speculative elements and everything is a little unreal, and it concerns monsters, both literal and metaphorical, of the uniquely modern kind, I like to think.
Definitely. And my novel is, as I said, about a serial killer, but it's actually not really about him at all. It's about the women in his life who are deeply and permanently affected by his crimes. It's sort of about the tangle that male violence always leaves behind. So, yeah, you guys are here for the comedy show, right? It's a little dark.
We actually met because of one of the stories in this book.
We do. I remember it very well.
There's a story in this book that was solicited for a reading series here in Seattle at the Hugo House. And at that night at the reading, after the end of the reading, Danya came up to me in the signing line.
And I was basically like, oh my God, will you be my best friend? And now here we are. And that was about 3 years ago. And I remember I sort of like forced myself upon you and was like, we have to get coffee. Like, let's just hang out. I just moved here.
You had just moved here, but you had already like built a Seattle writing community that it was wonderful to join, and that was actually based here in this bookstore. Like, you brought me here to Cafe Arta in the back over there to work on these books, and then a lot of these books were written back there, like, 50 feet that way. And so many things had to happen for this to work out this way, for us to be sitting here together, to have sold books in the same season, to have books come out a week apart, all because you dragged my very awkward self out for coffee.
Truly, it was my pleasure. I kind of can't believe how lucky we are in that we've been, working together once a week for, 3 years, and to have this happen a week apart is just like kind of magical. So it's still kind of unbelievable. We've been looking forward to this moment and this event for such a long time. So I do have some questions for you.
All right.
And it's funny because I've never actually asked you a lot of these questions, even though we sit
I
together
was
and we
just
talk
thinking
about writing
I
all
was
the
thinking
time.
about that all day today too. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have written quite a few books. You've written fiction, you've written poetry, you've written short stories, you've written novels. You've like really been doing it all for a long time. And I'm curious about the experience of writing this book, sort of where it came from. If you could tell us a little bit about sort of how this book started and how you moved through the process.
Sure. So I started writing this book towards the end of 2017. And I actually keep a spreadsheet of all the books I've read starting from 2010. I don't have a really cool detailed process journal as Danya does, which I want to talk about. But I do have this spreadsheet of books. And I went and looked recently because I was curious about what was the last book I read in 2017? Like, what was the last book I read before this happened? And it was Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. So clearly, like, that
Something
got in my head.
happened.
Something happened there. But as you said, like, up until that point, I had been much more of a multi-genre writer. Like, I had written fiction and nonfiction and poetry kind of all at the same time. And then just from then on, for 3.5 years, all I wanted to write was short stories. It was an obsession, and it was like all I could do. And so I started writing 2 stories simultaneously then. And then, you know, I was lucky that some solicitations came in for short stories and some like reading series and events. And that kind of kept me going. And I knew as I was going that these stories were thematically connected. But I think like I wouldn't have been able to say, you know, what they were, what those connections were until I was like almost done. And the experience was totally different than writing a novel, I would say. You know, I think that with a novel, it's like the way I think of it is it's like you're trying to build a house while you're living on the construction site. You know, you move in and you just chip away at it every day, you know, nail by nail. Writing the short stories was like trying to build tiny little machines, you know, like it was so much more precise and like consuming in a totally different way. You know, I feel like a novel, like you move in and it eats your life kind of, and a short story, it's like you're at it with your tiny little tools all day long, you know, and it's like this big, and it's like everything has to be quite right and in a very different way. But it was like I couldn't not write it, you know. And as I'm sure you know from having worked in so many different aspects of the industry, like you do get a little pushback, you know. There are people who say things about short stories, you know, who think that they're not as serious or not as marketable as novels somehow. And I just could not be dissuaded, kind of, you know.
And there are many actual machines in your short stories. I'm thinking specifically of Time Cubes, which is the one that you read at Hugo House. So did you write that story around the time that you read it at Hugo House, where we met maybe 3-ish years ago?
Yeah. The theme for that night was Diving into the Wreck, based on Adrienne Rich's poetry collection. And in that poetry collection, there's a poem called Waking in the Dark that describes this film that shows divers at the Berlin Olympics, and the film shows them backwards and forwards. So they dive off the board, and then they reel back up into the sky, to the diving board. And in the story, there's a little device that has a knob on the side that reels time in the same way, forward and backward, for whatever's inside. So like a plant or like a human life.
It's a really devastating story. If you guys want to have your minds blown, you should read that one. It's like, it was the moment where I was like, I need to know this person. Was listening to you read that story out loud.
I am really interested in your experience having this being your second novel. I'm really interested in the sophomore novel experience in general. So like how your writing changed and how your process changed between the first one and the second one.
Oh, a lot. It definitely changed a lot. I think when I was writing my first book, Girl in Snow, that was kind of just an experiment to see. I mean, I knew I could write a novel. I wrote 3 novels when I was in high school, which is a fun fact. So I knew I could get to the end of a book. But I really wanted to do something a little older, a little more sophisticated with Girl in Snow, and it was really just for myself to do it. When you're writing a first book, you know, you never really have. You hope maybe someday it will get published, but you'd be really silly if you were doing it for that reason. And it's kind of impossible to do it for that reason because, you know, it usually doesn't work out the way you think it's going to. And so when it did get published, I was like, you know, pretty flabbergasted, and I would say kind of still am. But I think writing that novel was very much like, you know, I was in college. I wrote it on Sunday nights when I finished my homework. I wrote it the summer after graduation when I was working as a waitress, and I wrote it when I was working full-time as an editor in the publishing industry. And that was very much like a passion project, a project of the soul, et cetera, et cetera. And then when it sold and got published, I was like, oh, cool. This is crazy. And then the second time around is very, very different, as you know, having written multiple books. You know, you have some semblance of a readership. You have, people who understand what you aim to do with the first one and are curious what you're going to do with the second one. And for my second novel, I quit my day job and I moved out to Seattle where I didn't know anybody. And I sort of sat in my dark, drafty house and tried to write full time. And for me, that was not a good experience. I did do it. You know what? I did it and I wrote the book. But I've learned that for me, that like fully immersive way of writing life is just too alone. And it didn't work for me. So I've since found a happy medium, I think. But in terms of the physical craft of writing the second book, I was at a lot more false starts, which I had been warned about from other novelists, sort of saying, you know, you're going to start a book and it's not going to be what you think it is by the end. And that could not have been more true. I wrote many versions of this book that did not end up becoming the actual book, and it felt like a really long, twisty, arduous process in the way that my first one didn't.
I'm really interested in that too, and all the false starts and the books that could have been and didn't. And one aspect in particular is I heard you say in another interview that there are a lot of minor characters in this book who you played with making them full perspective characters. And when you mentioned them in that other interview, I was thinking about how those minor characters, like, they still have a really big impact in my mind, like in my memory of the book. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm thinking of, like, Ansel has a coworker, a Dairy Queen, mm-hmm. Who has a very important role in the plot, but you know, she doesn't end up being a perspective character. Or Ansel's brother's adoptive mother, mm-hmm. she's like such a memorable character mm-hmm. to me. But you know, again, it's like, and I was wondering how you made those decisions. Like, how did you know these are the women that need like full perspective, and these are the ones who will be as impactful another way? Yeah,
it's funny you asked that, because in a way I feel like they were talking to me, and I don't know if you have that experience writing characters. Sometimes they feel more alive than other times. And I had, so I'll back it up a little bit and say I had written a version of this book that really was not working, that I had to get rid of, and I had to rethink exactly who was going to be in the book and what it was going to be about. And at that point I did sort of a series of auditions where I tried to write maybe like 10 to 12 women who were peripheral to the story in some way, most of whom did not end up in the actual book. And one of them, like you said, was a coworker, one was an adoptive mother, one was a courtroom illustrator. And part of the women I did choose, I think, were based on their personalities coming through. I always knew his mother, the part that I just read, was going to be a part of the book. I always knew she would be there. The other two, I found that what I needed to say to get the plot moving forward, they needed to be the ones to say it. So that it kind of answered itself in that way. Like, there was only one way to tell the story, and it was through these specific people rather than the other ones. But it was weird to, like, you know, there's a whole chapter of Olympia, the Dairy Queen girl, out there. It's in an old notebook somewhere, never to see the light of day.
I hope this is comforting to you in some way, but I definitely found the period of time between the first and second book to be the worst mm-hmm. in my span. Last year I was at a bookseller sales conference, and I met somebody who writes like romance and Western novels, and she asked me, you know, is this your first book? And I said, no, this is my fourth. And she said, oh, you write 4, you're gonna write 40. And
I love that.
I have been like clinging to that in my heart ever since. But I do feel like there is something uniquely hard about book 2. Yeah. And about sort of, was the first one a fluke? You know, mm-hmm. is this mm-hmm. real? Is this really going to be my life now? And I think you have arrived. You did book 2. It is a life. You've done it.
It's here. And you know, I do think there's also something about writing the first book where people say, oh, you're this kind of writer, you've written this one thing, it told me this about you, and that's what I know you for. And it can be very daunting to try to stay in that or break away from it, and I think in the end you just can't think about it too much. Do you find that that's the case with book 4, 5, 6?
I think something I've learned is that I can only write the thing I can write. Yeah. And in a way, it's like I even myself have very little control over that, let alone like an audience or a market, you know? I had a lot of, you know, as you were talking about novel ideas that just fell apart or you know, all these false starts and the novel's not what you think it is. Again, in that phase, like when I was going to novel 2, I feel like I had all these high concept ideas that were like things I wanted to write in a very at a very like high level abstract way. Like these are the kinds of things I want to write about, things I kind of want to talk about. But that's not the way I work. You know, I work from images and from sort of a like compulsions that I can't explain. You know, I have no idea why the stories that I end up writing are the ones that compel me all the way through. But you know, it's like I can't choose those. And I also had to learn, like you, that I can't work in that incredibly rigid, devoted way, you know, where you know, I'm so jealous of the writers who like, I get up at 5 every day and I turn out 1,000 words no matter what.
It's not me.
It's like, I can't work like that. And I never worked like that, right? But between book 1 and 2, I briefly had that dream, you know, like I'm going to be that kind of writer. Yeah. And that's never been how it's worked, right? I've always been the kind of writer that to sort of throw paint on the canvas and see what sticks, you know, and just plays around with images. And now, you know, staring down the barrel of book 5, I do feel, you know, I'm sure you're going to have to listen to me complain for years.
I'm sure I will.
How hard book 5 is and how it's just not working. But right now, I do feel more comfortable with my own very messy process. You know, I do believe in it because it has served me before, right?
Yeah. At some point, I think you just have to accept, like, I feel like we're always like, how's the writing going? And then we're always like, boof. And I think that's just always how it's going to be, you know?
That's the point of having writer friends.
Exactly. So I do have a process question for you related to that. So when you're writing short stories, are you working on multiple at a time? Do you have, like, you say you work from images. Do you have, you know, multiple images that are coming to you at once and you're sort of toggling between them? Or are you working for like 1 month on one story? I don't write short stories really ever. So I'm very curious what that looks like.
So the first 2 stories I worked in this collection, I did write simultaneously. But after that point, each one, it was one at a time. And I was very deeply immersed in each one. And I remember specifically the feeling of trying to exit one and enter another was very challenging and sort of strangely exhausting. Like
I can't imagine that.
It was similar to like trying to leave a novel, you know, and trying to start a new one, except I had to do it 12 times. And so that was actually difficult because I did want to go in just as deeply as I did with my novels and know these characters just as well and be envisioning them as fully, even as most of it was going to be off the page.
Would you say you like finished one before you would move on to another? Or at least like, you know, finish the structure of it? Or how far did you have to go into it to feel like you could do another one?
They were pretty much done before I moved to the next one. Although I will say, in the editorial process with my editor at Tin House, Maisie Cochran, who is a genius, a lot of the stories did change pretty significantly, especially their endings. When I look at the book, you know, and when I look at the endings in particular, I think, thank goodness for Maisie, she had this wonderful gift for knowing when, you know, a story was a page too long or a page too short, you know, when that last beat needed to linger or when you needed to trust the reader that, you know, they get it. You don't need to hammer this home so hard. Do you have a lot of changes in the editorial process?
Yeah, I mean, talk about characters we threw away. When my wonderful editor Jessica Williams bought my book, there was a chapter in about 3/4 of the way through, told in letter formats, like epistolary, from a character named Blue, who is no longer a character. And it was never quite working. I never quite liked it. My dear partner, Liam, here can attest. I spent many nights literally physically crying over it. This one chapter, I would go into the office and be like, I'm going to figure it out. And I'd come back just like literally crying. And for whatever reason, it never came out right. And I submitted the novel and Jessica loved it anyway. And we agreed that the chapter wasn't working. And she said, why don't you give it to someone else? So I gave it to Safi, who is the female detective in the story. And she ended up living the series of events that Blue had been living instead. And it worked so much better. It was unbelievable. And from there, we realized that Safi was both like one of our favorite characters, and I just was able to like really pull her out from there, and she hadn't been quite as prominent before, and so that was all Jessica's doing. And Jessica also really dug into the more thematic elements of the novel in terms of, you know, doing justice to the stories of the victims of the murderer, the dead girls, and while not giving the entire novel over to the concept of the dead girls, because I already wrote a novel about a dead girl, and this one I didn't want to be about that. I wanted this one to be about living girls and women, but making sure that sort of the gravity of murder was on the page, and that was all her. So there's an epilogue to this book that I get a lot of comments about, and if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. And Jessica had seen from the very start that was important, and she had me pull elements of that in through the entire rest of the book and made it all the more powerful. So she's also, you know, just a total genius.
So the epilogue was there early on, and she just saw the way to feed through it towards the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing you need an editor
They're
for.
amazing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I'm curious. So you have many, many characters in this book. And I'm wondering if there's one character from one story or even just a cast of characters from one story who you wish you had more time with. Like, is there one who you're like, that one's so interesting to me and there's more there?
There is an element of this that is like, which is your favorite child?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
but there is one character in the book who's in a story called June Bugs, where she's escaping an abusive relationship, and she rents a house that gets infested by bugs, and the bugs are a little bit supernatural, a little bit malevolent, and they get tangled up in her memories of her abuser. Without spoiling the ending of the story, I do feel like she arrives towards a place of like a happier, healthier, almost triumphant place over the course of the story, and it does make me want to linger with her a little bit longer. Like I'm happy with the story where the story ends. I think the story ends in the correct place, but I do think she's the character that I wish more for. You know, I hope I envision her in a happy next chapter in her life.
Yeah. You know, I really hate moths. They're like my worst fear ever.
I
And
knew-
that
I think I knew
story
that.
just killed me. I could not sleep for like days after I read that. If you don't like bugs, definitely read that one.
I think you and I planned like a camping trip or something once where we said I would be on moth duty.
Yeah. Well, we had talked about our whole writing group going on like a retreat, and someone was like, I don't like flies. And I was like, I don't like moths. Someone else was like, I don't like spiders. So we never went, but hopefully we will.
I think I said like I will sweep them out.
Yeah, you were the brave one.
Well, you know, I spent like 4 months writing the story.
Yeah.
I was living with the bugs. In my
Yes,
head.
you were. I admire it.
I brought up your process journal earlier, and I was wondering if you would mind talking about it, because I think it's just such an interesting aspect of the way you work and really useful to a lot of writers and aspiring writers and actually artists in general.
Definitely. So I started keeping a really intensive process journal for the writing of this novel, and I had never kept one before. I did not do this for Girl in Snow. But when I sort of sat down and was like, I'm a serious writer now, I got myself a notebook and decided to really record the process of writing the book. And this became a pretty neurotic, pretty intense process very quickly. And for me, I filled up quite a few notebooks, and I'm extremely particular about them. It's always extra large black moleskin, with a soft cover, no lines, no dots. I almost always buy them here at Third Place Books. And I use a fine tip black Sharpie. And I'm like, you know, I will never sway. But I usually divide the notebooks up into a couple different sections. And this is a notebook that I keep just for my novel project and for nothing else. So I'm not like putting my to-do list in there. It's just for this one novel project. And I kind of wonder how you could translate it to short stories, actually, but that's a different conversation. So I divide it into sections. The first section is sort of like a daily process journal, like you're sitting down and you're just saying what you're working on that day. The second section is like research. So if I'm, you know, working one day and I'm like, oh, I need to research this one thing, I'll just, you know, make a note of it. And then later, if I come across something, I'll put it in the notebook. The next section is a free writing section. So just like, you know, if I feel like not typing that day, I'll just write in the notebook. And then the last is my favorite, which is like inspirational quotes. You know, like writers are always tweeting, and I often will find their tweets and be like, oh, I'm going to remember that. And then I put it in my process journal so that when I'm feeling stuck, I go back and look at what someone smarter had to say about it. So it was a really immediately compelling way for me to do it. And the most important thing for me is the daily journaling. So really sitting down every single day, writing down the date. I keep track of how many hours I write because I find that that's a great marker of sort of time and of work, even when it doesn't feel like the manuscript's moving at all. So I write down the number of hours I work. I write down what's working that day, what's not working, and what comes up next. So every time I sit down, I can sort of look back at the history of the book. You know, they say like writing a book is like feeling your way across the country in the dark or whatever that is. And like, I feel like with a process journal, you can like at the very least see where you've already been. It's not all dark behind you, right? It's just dark ahead. So I find that method really, really helpful. And I tell it to a lot of writer friends and clients as well to just try it. Because I think knowing that you show up for yourself and having that physical evidence and that physical proof that you're working, even when it feels like the manuscript is going backwards, I think it's so important.
That's something that was so valuable to me about the writing group that you formed, actually, is I felt like it's like what you said about showing up for yourself, you know, and treating the work as important, because that was something that I struggled with. You know, I feel like you know, when I'm alone at home, it's easy to feel like the writing is not important, you know, that other gigs are more important, you know, that my teaching is more important, or even like, you know, paying my taxes or like cleaning the counter, you know, everything else feels more important than the writing. Like, it's like, who cares? These are just like my fantasies, right? Yeah. And then, you know, you created this community where we would show up and we would say, the work is important. You know, this is our real work. These are our careers. You know, we are here together to do to treat this work as important and treat each other's work as important and treat each other's time as important. And that was really important to me and like changed everything sort of in my mindset.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will also commend us for being pretty good about working for an hour before we gossip, which I feel like is pretty impressive, frankly. We're really good. We like show up and we sit down and we open our computers and we really don't talk for an hour. It's kind of amazing.
It's the promise of all that juicy gossip at the
I
end.
know, it really is. It really is. It really is. So having written this book and sort of being on the other side of it, I'm curious what was really fun for you in the writing of this book. Like, what's a thing that this was a two-part question. I'm that guy. What's a fun part of this book that you think you'll miss working on? Like, it could be, you know, a character, a story, or even just like a feeling. And then what's something that you're looking forward to in your next one?
I'm going to start with the second part of that. Something I'm looking forward to is returning to the novel form. I do feel like I reached a point with the stories where I felt like I'm ready to change forms again, you know, like where this short story session had ended. And now I felt like I'm interested in other questions that maybe you need to meander a little slower for, you know, maybe you need to let meaning build in a different way, let scenes build a different way. As opposed to like a short story where I feel like you have the one idea that is like core to everything and you're turning it really carefully and you're looking at it from every possible angle, you know? So I do feel ready to move on in that way, and also to write more broadly again. Like, I am having ideas for nonfiction again and for essays I might want to write.
I'm excited for that.
But I am unclear still at this point if my next novel is going to be more realist or if it's going to continue through with more fantastical and speculative elements. And something I did enjoy is working out the world building and the technology that doesn't end up being on the page in the story, you know, but having it very clear in my mind and going through the sort of the imagined mathematics of the whole thing. You know, it's like, how would this work and what ripple effects would this have on the world and how would it function out in the world and what would it do to the economy, that kind of like, I think going through those questions in my head, even as I think very little of it end up being relevant to like what I'm trying to tell, which are like smaller, more human stories, was really fun, and is something that I will miss.
It's like kind of amazing to think of the novel as like a thing that exists in your head separately from how it exists on the page, right? Like, I at least have so many backstories that aren't even there, that like, you know, a reader would never think to know, that are just like secretly in here that I don't even realize are in there, right? Like all these character backstories and things like that. Do you find that in short stories that's also the case? You're just building the whole world all the time?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, that's an interesting point. Is have people, I mean, I know the books just came out, but have people brought anything to the book that has surprised you? Like that their version in their heads is different than the version that you wrote?
I've been really enjoying reading some of the Goodreads reviews where people are like, what just happened to me? And I'm like, I love this. Like, a lot of people are like, I don't really know what I just read. And that makes me really happy, in like a good way, right? But in terms of like bringing something really specific to it, I think that will probably take a little more time as I, you know, get a little more have more conversations with readers. It's so hard in COVID because we're not really able to have that in the same way. Like, I used to, you know, be in signing lines and people would say like, oh, I took this one character element and I related it to my life in this way. And it's kind of a bummer to not have that anymore. Yeah. Have you had that experience?
One really specific thing is that there are just a couple stories where the gender of one of the characters is not made explicit, and I think there's a lot of reasons to read them one way, and it's been interesting to me to see readers who read it another way. You know, like readers, like there's a character that 90% of readers read as a woman and then 10% read as a man, and it's like interesting to come across that. And then there's another character where the reverse is true, like the vast majority of people read this couple as a straight couple, and then some readers read them as a lesbian couple because the gender of one of them is never specified. And that's been really interesting to me, and also like the effect that has on reading the whole story I think is really interesting. I had to make hard distinctions for the audiobook. When we were casting, I had to say should it be a masculine voice or a feminine voice? But I think the ambiguity on the page is sort of more interesting.
Which story is that?
So the first story, pre-simulation consultation, has two characters who neither of them, their gender is indicated. And people mostly read it one way or the other. And then 20 Hours, which is a story about a married couple, and they have a body printer that allows them to be reprinted at the moment of death under certain circumstances. And after owning the machine for a while, they get a little antsy and they start killing each other to use it. And
as
also
one does.
as one does. And then also just, to explore issues in their marriage. And I think, and so that story also, like, it doesn't make it explicitly clear who the gender of the first person narrator. And so that was interesting to see how people read it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't had any of that just yet, but all you out there on Goodreads know I'm looking.
You're brave.
I know.
I cannot tread the Goodreads, the fields of Goodreads.
Yeah, it's a scary world out
I think
there.
they're not for me.
Have you been reading anything lately that you're loving?
I'm in the middle of How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. Have you read this?
I have not, but Jessica Williams, my editor, is also his editor, and I've heard wonderful things about it.
Okay, right. I'm in the middle of it, and it's extremely interesting and extremely imaginative. It is a pandemic story though, and it is about a pandemic worse than ours. So I go back and forth between being like, this is such a gorgeous book, I'm loving this, and then being like, God, is this next month? I hope this isn't next month.
Yeah, I struggle with that as well. I'm watching Station 11 and having some similar feelings. So,
on that note, I was wondering about your relationship to true crime, having written, 2 books now about murder, and this one about a serial killer, and with very specific thematic goals about sort of deconstructing the serial killer myth. Kind of what your relationship was to true crime stories, like both before you wrote the book and during and now after.
Yeah, I mean, I love true crime. I think that probably comes through in the book. I'm an avid consumer of all the true crime media, books, podcasts, movies, documentaries. I've really watched all the murder stuff out there. And I think we need to talk more about why we like it so much, right? And it's a genre that almost the entire audience is women, and I think that's really, really fascinating. And part of writing this book was sort of an interrogation of that question, right? Of why can't we look away from murder, and specifically from murderers, and specifically men who kill women. And I think that was a huge question for me. Also, Ted Bundy. I mean, I always end up talking about Ted Bundy. There's so much Ted Bundy content out there in the true crime world, and it's really amazing to me that we just keep going on about Ted Bundy. He's been dead for like 30 years. And there's still new movies coming out about him, and there's like unheard tapes of Ted Bundy. And I got to a point when I was writing this book and doing research, and every time Ted Bundy would pop his face in, and I'd be like, why are you here? And I think that question of like, why do we love him so much? What is so interesting about this man? Really led me to ask some of the questions that I asked in the book. But I love true crime. And I'm guilty of the voyeurism that I'm also sort of
interrogating.
Yeah, questioning, right? And I'm kind of okay with that too, right? Like I enjoy it for the sake of it in the way that everyone else does as well. But I also sort of look back at myself sometimes and I'm like, why are you like this?
I also ask you about your research, because you mentioned that just now. Like I heard you say in another interview that your research tends to happen towards the end of your writing process, like once you're clear on what all your research questions are. And I was wondering, with this book, like when you came to that point, what were those research questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the thematic research was just research by osmosis, research by 10 plus years of watching network crime television and watching these movies that I found interesting, and watching Law and Order for so long and loving it, and seeing that narrative over and over and over again, and pulling tropes from it and cliches from it that I found interesting. So I think I think the thematic elements were just naturally researched, and the research that I had to really dive into was research about the death penalty, research about the specific prison that the book takes place in, which is an actual prison in Texas. It's where a third of the country's executions take place. And I knew that I really needed to get that right. And I had a moment where I was like, I have to really figure out what exactly happens here. Because if it's going to be in this book, it has to be the truth, or the closest thing I can find to the truth as a person who is not on death row. And to do that, I do not have the research skills for that, nor do I like to research enough to do that. So I ended up hiring a research assistant, which was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Shout out to Dylan Simberger. He's in my acknowledgements as well. And he was a PhD student who lived in Houston, and he talked to a lot of ex-correctional officers from the specific prison I was writing about. He talked to judges, he talked to lawyers, and people in the community who, you know, sort of knew more about the system than I did. He was also really helpful with some of the details about policing, which and how the police system specifically in upstate New York works. Because that was also something writing Girl in Snow that I had to do a lot of research about. And that for me does come like horrifyingly late in the game. It's like I've just made it all up, and then I have to be like, I have to do it right. So we have to go back and fix it.
How does that relationship work? Like, what kind of material does he send him, or do you send him you know, writing? Or?
I sent him a really long list of questions. That was basically like, I need to know, you know, what do they eat for breakfast? What does it look like physically? What time do they eat? What time do the officers come check on them? You know, things like that were just like, I was realizing writing the scenes, what I needed to know, and then I would ask him, and he would go out into the world and find and deliver me a report. And it was actually it was really amazing. It was really cool to see him do, you know, all this really heavy lifting in a field that he knows a lot about. So it was cool.
I've started doing a little bit of research for my novel, and it is funny to think about how strange and invasive, in particular, the questions a novelist asked are.
I know.
You know, like I've been interviewing game developers, and sometimes I do say things like, "What do you eat for breakfast?" And they're like, "Why?"
Yeah.
It's like, this is how fiction works. Yeah. I'm sorry. It is weird.
Important. So did you have to do a lot of research for the collection?
A lot of it happened by osmosis in that way that you're talking about. There's like really specific images and moments that I do remember deep diving into. There's like one paragraph about a wolf where I remember spending a whole day like reading about wolves and what they look like, and what would it look like if the wolf were sick versus versus healthy, like how large are they relative to other things. I fell down many rabbit holes along the way for like specific moments.
Do you like researching?
Yes, but for me it's dangerous because it doesn't work the way it does for you. I don't do it at the end when I have like clear questions in mind, right? For me it is like a hole I can fall to at the very beginning, you know, where I could research forever, and then when do you actually start writing? Or you're researching because you're just sort of poking around, like looking for the idea or your way into the story. I used to do, more reported nonfiction, and I think that's something I miss a little bit, and so it does kind of scratch that itch. And some of it is like just getting to talk to people, about their lives and about their work and their jobs, and like getting to hear people talk about things that they're passionate about is something I really enjoy. And it's, I miss having a pretext for that, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
Are we getting a signal about audience
questions?
questions?
I saw you. Yes, we're okay. Okay, fantastic. Cute audience. Do you have any questions? Yes.
So the question was about casting for audiobooks and like the degree to which we're involved. I will actually, it would be interesting to know your thoughts on this because, again, from both sides as an agent and author, my sense is always that authors usually don't have a lot of power in that situation. Like it is more a courtesy for audiobook producers to involve you. But it like contractually, generally you have no power. It's just like, we'll be nice and ask your opinion. And so I was consulted more than usual actually for this particular cast because it is a large cast recording. There are 5 narrators who occur in different combinations because some of the stories actually require more than one. And they did actually involve me, and they did ask me gender preference for individual narrators. So like, do you envision this character? And they also asked me if there were like aspects of the character that were not obvious, like that weren't on the page exactly, that I felt were important in casting. And then they did, it's fine, I can do that. Talk to me. They did ask me about like the specific people they had casted, and my take on them and the stories as they had been arranged. And yeah, and which I was very grateful for.
Yeah, I also was given options, which I was also very grateful for. I had I think maybe 5 male narrator options and 5 female narrator options, because the book is told from both. And I had some really visceral reactions to some of them.
Oh.
There were a couple where I was like, oh, that is just not right. Like, oh, that is not the right sound. And I think when you've read a book so many times in your own head and in your own voice, it feels really weird to have it coming from someone else's voice. So I can't listen to my I
was
would
just
never
going to
listen
ask
to
that.
my
Have you listened
audiobooks,
to your
no way.
audiobook? Okay.
I've listened to the samples and I know they're fantastic. So the 2 narrators that were my favorites were able to do it, and they are what you hear in the audiobook now, and I think they're amazing. I've listened to the samples of both of them, and yeah, it's really interesting to hear sort of the cadence of sentences that you've had in your head for so long, just totally different. Like I listened to the beginning, the passage that I just read for you guys. I always hear it like that in my head, and I listened to the audiobook. That was the audiobook sample, and she does like a whole like voice acting situation for the dialogue where I was like, what are you doing? But it sounded great. So yeah, it's just a different experience.
I've done the exact same thing. Like I've listened to the samples to be sure I'm happy with them, but I could not listen to the whole thing. Absolutely not.
No
Right.
way, yeah.
It's like someone like narrating your own dreams back to you.
Yes.
You know, it's like, what do you mean? You weren't there.
Yeah. Stop it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody? Yeah.
You guys talk about how you come up with the titles? Were they always these titles? Did it change? Did your editors do that? Because I'm struggling with that now, so I want to hear your guys'.
The question is how we came up with our titles, and I heard some chuckles from some dear friends of mine in the audience, because titles for me are just the bane of my existence, and I cannot do them ever.
That is also something we talked about, like 50 Feet That Ways. I remember
For
going
years.
through titles and titles and titles. Yeah.
So this book was called The Blue House for a long time. There is a space in the book called The Blue House. It's a restaurant. And when I titled it The Blue House, the physical place, the Blue House, was a much bigger part of the novel than it is now. So it didn't really make sense. It also wasn't particularly evocative of any, specific feeling. I'm very happy with the title we landed on, specifically with the cover packaging. So how about you?
I was sending early versions of these stories to a friend as I was going. And at one point, when they were starting to pile up and I was like, okay, I think this might be a book, I said, what really stands out to you? What do you remember? And they said the literal monsters. I remember the sea monster. I remember the bugs. I remember the girl with wings. And they're also a visual artist. And so they told me that when they pictured the book, they saw it as like an illuminated medieval manuscript, with like little drawings of the monsters as you went along. And then I started to think of the book that way. I started thinking of it as like a bestiary, like kind of like an encyclopedia where you could look up these different monsters. And then I guess that got in my head and it stuck. And again, I there's a lot about technology and like near future possibilities. And so
it's also your cover. It's like exactly that, the bestiary, right? And I think it looks so beautiful with the title too.
I love both our covers.
Okay, we have a question. Jules asks, Kim, did you explore early voices for your what? NB voices. Thank you. Yes. Did you explore NB voices for your non-gendered characters?
So the way it was always phrased in casting was like a masculine voice or a feminine voice were the options presented. And I think, and a lot of the voice actors we looked at, they had some range in that direction, which I appreciated. I actually did nix a voice actor who I felt like did not have range, sort of. I felt like that they, all of the samples I could find of them did feel like they can do sort of one age, one gender, one sort of vibe, and that didn't feel appropriate. It was like, okay, so I was asked in a general sense about gender of specific characters where it wasn't clear, and then I was presented with 6 possibilities for a 5-person cast, and I just nixed one. that was the degree of involvement I had.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, I couldn't. I at no point did I like get into the nitty gritty in that way. I explained like my take on characters having ambiguous gender, and then this was the cast I was presented with, and then that's what happened next.
That's awesome. Yeah, in the back. Mm-hmm. Lucy asks, do I ever scare myself while I'm writing? No, but I do make myself like very upset sometimes. I don't think I really scare myself. I mean, the content usually for me leans like really sad more than scary. So I definitely sadden myself. But that's how I know I'm doing it right. Like if I'm like feeling a little moved by my own work, then I'm like, okay, something is good here, right? But I definitely do scare myself doing research. Like I watched like Silence of the Lambs and was like, oof, no thank you, that's not the kind of thing I'm trying to do here. So that scared me for sure.
Something I thought was really interesting about the marketing of your book is I've seen it with like fox emojis and like stuffed foxes, and there's all these like cute fox imagery being accompanied with like Instagram posts of your book and that kind of thing. And the fox in your book is an extremely disturbing image that involves like the lifelong trauma of a young girl, right? And so
fox is super dead.
Yeah. And so, yeah, when I see it with like a cute fox emoji, I'm like,
you say this, I have foxes on my nails right now. I don't know if you guys can see that. I have a little fox on my nails. It's really cute, right?
So there are very frightening moments in your book.
Yeah, that one is really frightening. And I love the British cover of the book has a fox sort of like gazing out in a very startled way from the book cover. But I look at it and I just see my dog who looks like a fox, and it's hilarious. So I think it's cute. Any last questions from the audience? Yeah.
So this may be a weird question, but do you ever dream about your characters? Do they ever enter into your dreamy life? And this is for both of you.
The question is, do we ever dream about our characters? I don't dream about my characters, but sometimes I dream about I dream in like paragraphs. I have like a weird visual like brain that way. So this is really, wow, this is more than you asked for. Sometimes when I think I see in words, so as a child I could say any word backwards. I probably still can, because when I see, I'm not going to do it right now. Don't ask me. And when I'm thinking, I can literally see the words that I'm saying or hearing as like, Times New Roman in black 12-point font. It's really creepy, and sometimes I dream like that. So I don't dream my characters, no, but I do dream like that. How about you?
You do dream in paragraphs. Wow.
Yeah, it's really weird.
I don't sleep well. I've never slept well. There's a character in the book actually who is a lifelong insomniac as well. And I do a lot of my writing at night in bed, just in my head, sort of, where for me, it's very murky to tell whether I'm asleep or not, whether I'm dreaming or not. It's kind of like I go on little journeys and fugues that are related to the thing I'm trying to write. And happens at night, it happens in bed. I have no idea if they're dreams or not exactly.
Interesting. I make such an active effort to not do that when I'm trying to go to sleep.
That's maybe probably healthier.
Maybe that's why. But I have been looking at lately. So I've mentioned I've sort of found a halfway in terms of having a full-time publishing job, which I do have. I work as an agent, and then also being a writer. And for me, that halfway is sort of being able to enter the dream state of writing a book for about an hour or two every day. And I've really started to look at it as I say this very, very early in the process. Talk to me again in a year. But I've tried to look at it as an active meditation, or sort of an active entering a dream state and then coming back out of it at a really assigned time and place, which is at my desk at night from 9:30 to 10:30 or whatever it is. And for me, I find that looking at it like I'm going into a space where my brain is just gonna do that weird little thing has been better than looking at it like you have to sit down and write a novel.
Yeah. Because it's fun, right?
That's
is sort of the whole point. And that's the one thing you have control over, right? You don't have control over the market or what happens after, how people are going to react to it. But you do have control over, I'm going to go into this imaginative space where I want to go, right? Where I have where I have control.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to try to make something beautiful. I'm going to try to make something out of nothing, and whatever comes. But that is something unique and special that we get to do. And it's hard to remember that sometimes. I think when you get really caught up in other ideas of productivity, right? That you have to write and also get caught up in other aspects of this career. But at the heart of it is this creative, meditative act that.
I have a related question. Do you listen to music when you write ever?
Yes, I have discovered music without lyrics is best, or lyrics in a language I don't understand. Once I saw somebody say that they were listening to this one song from the soundtrack of In the Mood for Love over and over again while they were writing, and then I like wrote that way for a couple days, and I was like, this is a brilliant idea, this song is perfect. And then I saw later that they were writing an essay about In the Mood for Love, and I'm just nuts, right?
Well, okay, so I do that. I have one song for a book, usually, that I listen to over and over and over again for like a period of 5 years.
Because it gets the mood right,
It gets
right?
the mood
Yeah.
right. And I don't totally have, I have like now a playlist for my next one that I'm like just still choosing from. But like I'll sit down and I'll put the playlist on, and there'll be one song. Right now there's one that I'm like liking more than the rest. And that might be it. But for this past book, it was a song called Creeks by Bon Iver, which is really sad and really dark and scary. And that song I just blasted for like 5 years straight. So yeah.
There's a local show here called Cafe Chill that plays on C89.5 that I found is perfect for writing for me.
That's really good to know. How are we? We're doing good. Yeah, okay. We're at 8:03. Oh, thank you guys so much for coming. This was so fun. Thank you.